Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today, and excited to present today's webinar, 5 Key Ingredients for Building Your Global Rotation Program. Just as a quick reminder for everyone listening in, today's webinar is being recorded, and we will send you a link to download the recording and the slide deck tomorrow afternoon, so please keep an eye out on your email inboxes for that message. If you don't receive that email, just let us know and we'll resend you the links to download recording, slide deck, and in tomorrow's follow-up email, you will also receive SHRM and HRCI continuing education credits. As always, we encourage you to ask some questions throughout the presentation today. To do so, please use the GoToWebinar control box that you should see on the right-hand side of your screen. Type that question in, and we'll try to get to it either during the presentation or at the very end during the dedicated question and answer session. For those that are unfamiliar with Envoy, for nearly 20 years, Envoy has been on a mission to fix the confusing, frustrating, and inefficient immigration process. Envoy combines expert legal representation with innovative technology to deliver the only platform that makes it seamless for companies to hire, mobilize, and manage a global workforce. Envoy secures work authorization in over 150 countries, has grown 41% year over year, and works with over 1,000 customers. We are particularly proud of our NPS score, which is a testament to the employee experience that we provide. And joining us this afternoon is Karima Hayes, an immigration manager with the Envoy, with Envoy's global team. Karima has extensive U.S. immigration experience as a paralegal and as a case manager, and she has over 3 years of global immigration experience. Karima currently serves as the subject matter expert within 50-plus global destinations. Karima, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks so much for having me, Eric.
All right, Karima, before we dive deep into things, I just want to provide a glimpse of the agenda today. I did not put up the key ingredients because I want to go through those during the main presentation. So just a brief overview here. And as always, the content in this presentation is not intended as legal advice. If you have additional questions or would like additional information on the issues discussed, please consult with a qualified professional. All right, so let's hop into the main presentation, starting with just today's global mobility landscape. So Karima, kind of kicked things off here. In our 2019 Immigration Trends Report, we surveyed companies, just kind of curious to see how they expect their demand for work authorization, global work authorization, either to increase, decrease, remain the same. And in 2019, we found that 48% expect their global work authorizations to either somewhat increase or significantly increase. And as we take a look at the slide here, while we notice that it is a decrease from the numbers in 2018, still nearly 50% of companies expect their global work authorization to increase. Is this in line, Karima, is this in line with what you've been seeing this year, even going back to last year?
Yes, absolutely. So we definitely know that there is a correlation between the increase of global assignments and the increase of stringency, not only in U.S. immigration laws, but certain jurisdictions as a whole. And I think this is resulting in companies looking at alternative options to move their talent globally. Okay,
cool. And as we move on to the next slide, some other stats to share. The one I want to focus on here is the 71% of millennials say they want and expect international assignments, and that comes from a PwC study. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about millennials in the workplace, this and that, but again, Karima, a question for you is, I guess, two-parter. Is this also in line with what you're seeing, with just the demand of millennials wanting to work overseas?
Yes, absolutely. I think given the competition for global talent, employees are becoming overall a lot more mobile, and millennials are seeking those types of companies that are offering these types of programs as a benefit and a long-term career path.
Okay, cool. And the second part of this question is millennials. Is this a trend in other countries as well? So, for instance, are millennials in the UK, in France, Germany, are they wanting to travel to other countries to work?
Yes, definitely. We're seeing an increase in just global mobility as a whole. Companies are really starting to establish larger mobility programs to address this global need.
Mm-hmm.
So we're definitely seeing that trend.
Gotcha. Cool. So great that you brought up the global mobility program, because that's what the presentation today is about. So on this next slide here, we have the key ingredients for building your global rotation program. We will go in depth on these 5, but I just want to name each one. So the first one here, we have defining program and goals. Then the second is strategic planning. Third is assessment. The fourth, execution. And the fifth, measurement and takeaways. So without further ado, let's hop into the first key ingredient, which is defining your program and goals. Karima, a question for you. We may have a couple attendees on the line. Just a general question is, what is a global rotational program?
Good question, Eric. So a global rotational program is a series of international assignments that allow employees to transfer periodically between office locations at a company. Typically, a global rotational program allows for an individual or a group of individuals to work for a designated period of time in a host country or multiple countries. Once the assignment is completed, generally the employee would either return home, or if the program allows for multiple rotations, that employee would then rotate to another shorter term assignment in the other country.
Okay, cool. So as we take a look at the slide here, what are some common goals of a program that someone may want to implement?
Sure. So it's really important to highlight the goals within the rotational program at the outset, especially during just the beginning stages. One of the main reasons why companies move towards establishing rotational programs is to increase employee satisfaction and retention. So this is done by clarifying, job roles, responsibilities, and really identifying corporate and employee concerns at the outset. Mm-hmm. In addition, companies must ask themselves different sorts of questions on how they're completing assessments to carefully select those applicants who will successfully complete the assignment and so forth. From the employee's perspective, these types of programs allow them not only to move around the organization, but to also develop more skill sets that ultimately provide them with job stability over time, which leads me to my second point here. Rotational programs can improve quality and variety of training and professional development.
Okay.
While being offered a rotational program position, it may not mean that that employee is immediately promoted. It does lead to some promotions after completing the program, which is greatly beneficial to the employee. And lastly, these types of programs increase employee exposure to different business functions and entities, which is why it's really important for companies to determine which employees will, rotate from which positions, and ask themselves, how are the employees and the company benefiting from the actual program?
Okay, cool. So now that we've identified, well, first off, what a global rotation program is, and maybe some goals that companies may want to utilize, it's time to move into the planning. So what can you tell us about the second key ingredient?
Sure. So as I mentioned, while most rotational programs involve the employee staying in the host country for a shorter time frame, we typically see it around 30 to 60 days, but we have seen some lengthier time frames, such as 8 to 10 months. Because these rotations are in theory shorter term, this can allow for the employer to include either one or multiple rotations overall for a specific individual or a team, obviously dependent on the need. A large consideration in establishing the duration of the program consists of multiple factors. A common theme we've seen are either the costs associated with renewals, the fact that employees' families cannot accompany the employee on the rotational program, given that it is essentially a shorter time frame. And sometimes this can impact the employee decision making. Another determination in the structure involves the destination countries. As we've seen in today's immigration climate, some countries are leaning towards more of a protectionist approach, and therefore would be eventually more difficult in terms of navigating the immigration process and the relocation process, versus other countries are leaning towards a more progressive approach that may further streamline the process for the employee and keep the employee timelines that the company wants and needs, essentially. This doesn't mean that those certain countries that have a streamlined process are more likely to approve an application, but some countries' processes are geared towards just simplifying really the process.
Okay. So one question while we're on this slide here is you mentioned that, sometimes short-term programs may be like 8 months or whatever. So is it possible for, let's say, a rotational program like employee A spends 4 months in France, and then after those 4 months they go to like Germany?
Absolutely, yeah. So it depends on the company's policy, but we've seen it all. We've seen the company sending the employee to one country for maybe 60 days and repatriating back to their home country. And we've also seen multiple rotations where they start in their home country and they rotate to up to 3 or 4 countries and then either repatriate on, or they are sometimes assigned a longer assignment within one of those countries.
Okay, cool. So we'll move on to this next slide here, establishing objectives.
Sure. So in terms of establishing objectives, the company must pinpoint the program's ultimate purpose, whether it be providing employees with new or existing training or professional development. In addition to that, staffing a foreign workforce to build and strengthen business lines, or to represent a company to foreign clients, and to have a presence on site. Companies may want to consider the fact that it may be difficult to complete certain negotiations without the company's presence in country. So ultimately, just having a foreign national on site would maybe be best bet.
Okay.
Overall, it's extremely helpful for HR and the company to set assignment-specific objectives ahead of implementing to benchmark employee performance and the ultimate program success. Really.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I guess so then, in terms of benchmarking, if the objectives are, I guess, not met, then companies can tinker with their program.
Yeah, they can then revise their internal policies, see what worked, see what didn't. Yeah. For
sure. Cool. So then, speaking of assessments, it's going to bring us to our third key ingredient here. So what goes into the assessment part ingredient, if you will?
Sure. So I think the assessment stage is definitely one that is at times overlooked, given that it involves determining the employee's specific eligibility for that specific country. Eligibility can involve the traveler's salary, their location, dual citizenship, the activities to be conducted, and if they're traveling intermittently and so forth. So those are all key considerations in determining assessments. Because the rotation destinations are at times already selected at this stage, it's really important for companies to get ahead of the country's immigration requirements and travel requirements, as they can significantly delay the timing of the process.
Okay. So on this slide here, we have education and experience requirements, specialty occupation requirements, and length of employment at sending entity. Does one of these take higher precedence over the other, or are they all equal in terms of eligibility?
I will definitely say they're definitely all equal. Educational and experience, I think, will probably trump the other ones, but depending on the country and if their need for that specialty occupation, I think all of them are pretty equal as well. And length of employment, that can consider other viable options for that particular employee.
Okay.
Detailed assessments to address, educational and experience requirements. Some countries, again, as I mentioned, have more stringent policies for new hires, specialty occupation requirements, which includes why, a role is highly specialized within that field, why a candidate from that destination country can't be hired, and at times, certain countries require labor market testing, which can, again, just increase the processing time significantly.
For sure. So you just mentioned regarding keeping up with, countries that some are getting more progressive in their immigration laws and whatnot. So what can you tell us about some? We highlighted a couple of countries. So what considerations should companies take into account?
Sure. So from the previous slide, the length of employment at the sending company, that's significantly can impact visa options. It can allow for intercompany options for all of these countries listed. We'll start with Canada. Canada has increasingly become an international hub for startups, tech companies, as you know. So specifically for the U.S., but other countries are following suit. So under the North American Free Trade Agreement, also known as NAFTA, U.S. citizens may be eligible for facilitated processing when applying for a work permit in Canada. So this can further, again, streamline the overall process and may be beneficial to the companies. Work permits under the provisions of NAFTA don't usually require that LMIA, which is the labor market impact assessment, again, which can significantly reduce processing time. So it is a highly sought out destination country for some rotational programs, especially if they're starting in the U.S.
Yes, definitely. And speaking of Canada, we 2 weeks ago we did a webinar with your colleague Marina and the CEO of a company called Mob Squad, where they went super in depth on Canadian immigration and everything. So if you're listening, so if you're listening and want to learn more about Canada, we have that recording up on our resources center. So highly encourage you to check that out. Anything regarding Germany, China?
Definitely. So Germany, and other EU countries in general, such as Italy, Spain, Hungary, may also have extremely lengthier processing times. So that's definitely a consideration. Some jurisdictions have consular appointments that are just pushed out for months, really, which can greatly impact the employees and companies' timelines and expectations, really. For example, we just had a specific request for German consulates within the U.S., scheduling appointments there, scheduling appointments within the German consulates in India. We know that appointment times have been pushed out for about, I would say, 3 to 4 months, which makes it super difficult to plan accordingly because the individual, they can monitor for a canceled appointment, but can't really gauge when that appointment will be available. So it just throws off the processing times for the work permit. It's really hard to gauge when we can actually get that employee on the ground. And I think that is just because Europe itself is becoming a bit more protectionist, and we're just finding that some countries are moving towards that. China is another example. They have very specific qualification considerations, specifically regarding education and experience, as I mentioned. While the country of China has a specific work permit process, the applications are actually processed by different bureaus within China. So Shanghai, Shenzhen, all the states have differing bureaus that adjudicate the application. So that kind of results in minor differences in the requirements, even though it's essentially the same type of work permit application.
So obviously these are only 3 countries, and there are hundreds in the world. But in terms of assessment, it's important to assess where you may be sending employees, because every country is going to be different, and some may take longer to get there.
Exactly. And China specifically, it has subcategories. So depending on the employee's eligibility, it can definitely take some time to assess, which may involve even guidance from tax professionals as well, because depending on the category, you may require, as the slide mentions, a medical clearance and a police clearance that needs to be issued from your country of residence, and those clearances not only take time to secure, but then they also need to be certified and then legalized if it's required. So because the process involves multiple agencies, it just impacts the processing time significantly.
Gotcha. And then we have here on this next slide, company registration requirements. So what should our attendees take away from this slide?
So another huge consideration in determining host countries in general is whether that particular country requires a company registration. So Australia, for example, requires a sponsoring company to hold an active standard business sponsorship. It's also known as an SBS, which is an agreement with the Australian government that allows certain Australian businesses to sponsor overseas foreign nationals to work in a highly skilled occupation. So in terms of determining the host company, we just want to make sure that they have that sort of sponsorship. However, Australia does have like a unique visa category, also known as a holiday visa, which allows certain nationals within a specific age range to travel to Australia for up to a year. And they may be able to work provided that they satisfy the conditions of the visa, obviously. But so this may be an option for companies who want to send younger professionals or new hires to those host countries within their program, because we have seen a significant amount of younger professionals rotating, given that housing is probably simpler and families and all those considerations. So in addition, I would say for the UK has a similar requirement where the company that is the sponsoring entity in the UK, they have to hold an active sponsor license in order to be able to sponsor any work permit application. If the company doesn't have an active sponsor license, they need to submit an application, and from our experience, the document gathering alone can take up to a couple of months.
Oh, really?
Just gathering all those documents from the UK perspective. It's very lengthy processing time too. So the UK generally doesn't have also any, short-term work permit options that don't require the sponsor license, which means, the sponsor license is required for companies that want to send employees to the UK. So I know we've had a ton of questions for the UK given Brexit and whatnot. So, of course, this is determined on a case-by-case basis, but generally for work permits, that sponsor license needs to be active and have the allocations for those employees.
And while we're speaking of countries, I guess have you worked with companies that maybe they only have one country they send employees to, and how do they go about maybe if they want to send employees somewhere else? Does a global rotation program, can they add more countries?
Yeah, so it definitely depends on their policy. Typically for rotational programs, you want to send them to your own entities because it's simpler and there's a lot of nuances if you're wanting to send them on a client side, because a lot of countries require that kind of sponsorship. So we see that mostly the companies sending them to one country want to stick with that country because it is a lot more streamlined, but we can always look into the options for that company to see if, client side is feasible or some other sort of sponsorship is feasible there.
Okay, cool. And, speaking of the UK, Brexit is supposed to happen October 31st. So we'll see. We'll provide any updates on that one. And this can bring us to the, costs obviously play a big role. So what can you tell us about the cost consideration?
Sure. So following the determination of the eligibility and the assessment stage, once you've determined that employee is eligible for that particular work permit, this is a good time to compile all the full holistic pricing for that employee's rotation. So this should include all global mobility aspects such as housing, cost of living allowances, cost for the work permits, filing fees, and the extensions. While the companies can gather the cost estimates for that particular rotation, it may be beneficial to also include unforeseeable costs and delays in expenses that the company may face, just to have them all incorporated within that, just so that the company's prepared. Given the current immigration climate, delays can significantly impact destination services portion of the rotation. I've had instances where the destination program relocation company wants to book the flights, but the work permit hasn't been approved, and it's based on work authorization if they can enter. ensuring that the permit is in the employee's hands when they've entered into a housing agreement, let's say, and sometimes, some housing agreements require copies of the appropriate permit. So it's important for all of it to flow and consider all those costs associated with any potential delays.
Okay.
So, this is why we're having a clear immigration strategy and a long-term plan for each employee is extremely crucial to avoid unforeseen costs and negative impacts to the employee's experience, really.
Definitely. So that's going to lead us to our fourth ingredient, which is the execution part of it. So pull up this slide here. What can you tell us about this key ingredient?
Sure. So once the employee has been determined as eligible, as I mentioned, once the program has and all the costs associated with the move have been notated, it's obviously time to execute the program. From our experience, we always recommend to start early, to prevent any unforeseeable delays, which can include both from the employee's perspective and the company's perspective. I'll say just a couple of examples from the employee's perspective. We've seen delays such as pushback and having maybe their spouses or families travel, and that can delay the offer for that rotational program. A couple of other examples, I would say, companies delays that can include just gathering corporate documents, that are necessary to file the application. As I mentioned, that sponsor license for the UK, I've seen document gathering can take up to like a couple months. So,
oh, wow.
It's really, again, really important to just start early to make sure that we're planning accordingly. Of course, this is barring any unforeseen circumstances and delays. We always recommend that. The other key ingredient listed here is to successfully execute a rotational program. Is to align stakeholders at the outset and throughout, honestly, the case progression and the process progression. We found that keeping the parties aligned allows the providers to clearly set expectations and to the appropriate stakeholders and business decision makers. In addition to the employee's perspective too, it's really beneficial to clearly define the roles so that they're aware of the appropriate contacts throughout their program, who to contact for what. And we also found that, technology has really impacted the employee experience as they're now able to, access any case status updates, communicate any concerns directly with the appropriate teams. We're able to schedule those types of calls in real time. And, they're able to access and ask any questions throughout the process and timeline. So, in addition, with the increase of security requirements we're seeing all over the world, it's really important to make sure that, your employees' documents are also stored compliantly and securely.
Right, definitely. I don't know if you have a number off the top of your head, but what's like an average number that's like the amount of stakeholders involved? And that includes like just various companies as well as the people within those companies, correct?
Yeah, I think it depends. So it depends how large if you have a global mobility program, who all needs to be involved. There's the HR approvals in terms of, applying the global policy, the costs associated. You have the relocation company who relies on your timelines, and then the employee, of course, who needs to be kept apprised of their timelines. It's their life that we're, uprooting and moving to another country. So it's just really important just to keep everyone aligned and on the same page, whether that is, weekly updates and keeping everyone on the same calls, keeping everyone pretty much, again, aligned to really understand and engage the timelines appropriately.
For sure. And that's going to bring us to our fifth and final key ingredient, which we've dubbed measurement and takeaways. So final key ingredient, how does this shape up a global rotational program? Yeah,
so I'll say once the program has been completed and the employee repatriates, it's important to gather the results of the program, obviously. Was the program successful in its mission? What were the total retention rates due to the implementation? Does the employee have additional opportunities now that they've completed the program, or what's the analysis of any exit interviews, if any.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's always important to ask those types of questions. I think, measuring the data is sometimes difficult because, especially if it's a newly established rotational program, what questions should we be asking? So I would say this portion of the process is sometimes overlooked, given, that the employee returns to either their previous position or another new position. So and at times they don't really receive that, reintegration training, and may feel, sometimes alienated returning back after being away for some time, especially if it is a lengthier rotational program. For sure, rotational programs, we haven't seen that too often, but it does happen. So it's really important just to make sure you're gathering that kind of data.
Okay. And are there other considerations that need to be taken into account for when measuring the success of a rotation program?
Yeah. So starting with a rotation program, it can lead to implementing a solid global mobility policy that can further lead to, longer-term assignments and other global programs. As I mentioned, the repatriation process is sometimes overlooked, but establishing and standardizing a repatriation process for the program participants is pretty key to the employee's overall retention too. So it's definitely important to be mindful of that consideration. Lastly, considering the benefits and the cost of adding additional programs and new offices can further expand, global talent in a more cost-effective manner that can apply, differing views, innovation, and creativity, and keep the program participants in constant communication given new technology. So there's a lot of benefits to establishing these type of programs, and also measuring the feedback that the employees provide.
Great. So, Karima, that's going to bring us we'll wrap things up for the main presentation. I guess my question to you before we hop into audience questions is just very general, but so what key takeaways, or what's a general takeaway that our audience should walk away with today?
Sure. Start early. I think the first step, of course, would be, depending on the company, would be to make sure, HR, global mobility program, what have you, has a sort of policy in place, such as what costs are going to be delegated and who will qualify for the program, what are the overall goals, as we mentioned, and just really follow those key ingredients.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So we have a couple questions already rolling in. Again, if you have a question that you would like to ask, please type that in to the GoToWebinar box that you see, and we'll try to get to it. But before I get to some of those questions, just want to highlight a couple of upcoming webinars that we have. So we have, those dates are mixed up there. So next, we have a definitive guide to H-1B alternatives, and then Perm Recruitment 102. So please click those links, and we, sign up for those. Be sure to subscribe to our mailing list to receive the latest webinar invites as well as content updates. And finally, on this screen here, we have the Sherman HRCI continuing education credits. As I mentioned at the top of the hour, these will also be emailed out tomorrow, but if you want to take a second to copy these down, feel free to. And so let's hop into some questions, Karima.
Sure.
Pull them up here. So this question here is, so we briefly mentioned Brexit, which the question is, how do I factor in current events? So obviously we have Brexit, and then you mentioned some countries are becoming a little bit more protectionist with their immigration policies, while others are becoming more progressive. So how can this individual factor in current events when setting up or refining a global rotational program?
Sure. So I think this would apply to, just planning on any kind of assignment, really, too, not only limited to rotational programs, but it's really important just to start early, get the assessment stage going just to determine and engage estimated timelines within that jurisdiction. Of course, immigration requirements are always subject to change, so we do always recommend to complete another assessment once it gets closer to that rotational program travel date, just to ensure that we're providing you with the most up-to-date timelines and red flags and caveats and so forth.
For sure. Great. So this question is, my company currently doesn't have a global rotational program. What are the first steps to get one in place, to get one up and running?
Sure. So yeah, as I mentioned, I think the global mobility program or HR would want to maybe make sure that they have some sort of international policy in place. I think that's definitely the first start. And then, again, as I mentioned, the cost associated in implementing that, who all needs to be involved, if you need an immigration provider or relocation provider and so forth, and just really combining all the pieces together to build that program. I think also the reason why you need that program really needs to be highlighted, what employees are going to be qualified for it, and what are you really seeking as the overall outcome of that program.
Gotcha. Thank you. This next question here is, so one of the key ingredients you touched on, short-term and long-term rotations. Can you elaborate a little bit more on those two phrases?
Yeah.
I don't want to say terms 3 times.
Sure. So I'll say it really, again, depends on the company policy, what constitutes a short-term versus long. I think we've seen, 60-day rotations. We've seen all the way up to 8 to 10 months. I'd say a long-term is typically beyond the 1 to 2 year mark.
Okay.
Just because you have those considerations of, do we relocate the family? Like, do we have permanent housing for them? And those types of considerations that aren't really brought up in the short-term sphere, really. Yeah.
Okay. And then we just had this question come in, 2-parter, just taking a brief look at it.
Yeah.
So okay, great. So the question here is, first part is, what challenges are companies having with global rotation programs?
I'd say the challenges are, from an immigration perspective, just the ever-changing immigration environment, focusing on starting early and maybe not starting early enough to, flag those considerations from an immigration perspective. Also, again, keeping all parties aligned, just because there are a lot of moving parts in relocating an individual that may not be considered. For example, housing needs to be corresponded with immigration to make sure that that's being panned out. And sometimes there's a lot of back and forth also from the assignee with HR in terms of what is going to be covered and not. And so in terms of the actual assignment agreement, there's a little back and forth there. Internal approvals. Yeah, so I think it definitely really stems on just starting early and keeping everyone aligned, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
The second part of that question is, does a relocation management company provide a cost-effective value to the company and employee experience?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Does a relocation management company provide cost-effective value to the company and employee experience?
I will say it definitely depends on the company's policy, of course. If they don't have those types of services implemented within the company, if they need to outsource that to a relocation company. We have seen that it does streamline the process a little bit, just so that the weight is lifted off of HR's shoulders and, applied to, relocation companies that can further advise on that. But again, it really just depends on the company policy and the cost effectiveness within their policy.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So we're at 1:44 Central, and so we have time for one more question here. Just quickly taking a look at it.
Yeah.
So the question here is, What's the main advantage to corporate businesses with global rotational programs?
I'll say, I think as we mentioned, millennials are seeking companies that that have those types of programs established, just because it is such a competitive market nowadays, and it's just an additional benefit to not only the company but to the employee in terms of skill set transfers and just having more exposure to the other entities too. So I think in terms of that, that's definitely a benefit for the employee. I think again, it's just a competitive market, and that's what they're looking for nowadays. From HR's perspective, I think it's definitely employee retention. Because of the competitive market, we have seen that employees are more inclined to potentially stay with the company longer, and it may be more cost effective depending on the company policy. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, that's going to wrap things up for today. Karima, thank you so much for the main presentation and for answering all those great questions.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we'll got to follow up on this one. And yeah, so it's the end of the main presentation. As a reminder, the recording and the slide deck will be emailed out tomorrow afternoon, in addition with the continuing education credits. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and have a great rest of your day.